Tuesday's deadly terror attack in New York was certainly a wake-up call for many Americans. A tactic used by terrorists in Europe and the Middle East, using trucks and cars to attack innocent bystanders, is now obviously something we see here in the U.S. For more on preventing attacks such as these, let's bring in Robin Simcox, terrorism and national security analyst with the Heritage Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us, Robin. We appreciate it.
Great to be with you.
First and foremost, for our viewers at home, has there been a vehicular plot that's been thwarted, whether it be in Europe or in the Middle East or here in the U.S., that we're aware of?
No, there's been fantastic difficulty stopping these kind of attacks in the U.S. and in Europe, and I've looked at all the data on this. There's never been a single occasion yet where the authorities have been able to get wind of a plot ahead of time, thwart it before it takes place. And of course, we've seen the results of that in Nice, in Stockholm, in Berlin, across Europe, and of course now on the streets of New York.
So how do you even begin with prevention? You know, we've heard people throw around well, there should be a background check when you're just trying to, or it should be more difficult just to rent a van or a truck, or there should be additional concrete barriers. Both of them are fairly unrealistic. We've seen New York ahead of the marathon, and they're putting up concrete barriers, and that's expensive. It's time consuming. It definitely distorts traffic. I mean, these are things that are difficult to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and this is the direction that certainly they're going in Europe, where you're seeing barriers being put up around very popular tourist sites. They're being put up on bridges across the UK, across France and Germany and Italy. They're starting to talk about background checks now for people who want to hire vehicles, which all makes sense in isolation. But, you know, terrorists are resourceful. If they really want to get hold of a truck or a car, they can steal one rather than renting it. So that's where you need to look at how can we get the best quality intelligence as early in the planning process as possible to stop these attacks before they can take place. And of course, that's the really difficult stuff.
Well, and you talked about some of these background checks. I mean, this particular assailant, I mean, if you talk about a profile, he didn't necessarily have any red flags. I mean, we've learned more about the fact that he had a temper, but there wasn't necessarily red flags of extremism, if I'm not mistaken. So how would that have prevented it? Yeah,
well, I mean, this is absolutely right, and this is why it's such a major problem for law enforcement and intelligence agencies. Saipov there wouldn't have been any red flags with him. He appears to have been a case of essentially someone who radicalized while in the US. So that's where, again, you need to look at the question, how does this radicalization take place? What happens when someone comes over from Uzbekistan to the US, and with all obviously the amazing opportunities that presents for an immigrant into the country, and then takes this violent path and does so without it raising any red flags with anyone reporting that to law enforcement? It's a really, really troubling picture.
I want to, before I let you go, I do want to just get your opinion on the diversity visa lottery that's been called the green card lottery. I want to ask you sort of your reevaluation of it with your research. A lot of criticism, obviously, we heard it from the president himself. What do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the president has been very clear on his thought of this, and I would be surprised now if it didn't get looked at. I think there's a whole host of things around immigration which the US is obviously going to be considering for good purpose. But we do also need to remember this isn't entirely an immigration issue. The homegrown radicalization in the US is also a problem. So we need to look at the roots of radicalization as well as practical things we can do around borders, around intelligence, around safety on the streets, as we're seeing with the New York Marathon, and barriers to stop these things happening again.
And that sort of brings me to my last question, because the takeaway here was that he wasn't radicalized overseas. He was radicalized when he came to the United States. And in fact, there was talk about why he moved to the U.S. in the first place, and it was just really for monetary reasons. He wanted to have a new life and make some money, and it wasn't the fact that he was radicalized and came here. So I'm sort of curious as to what can be done in the U.S. When folks do come here, whether or not they come through a diversity lottery program or they come through a different way. What can be done in that stage?
Well, isn't this the really concerning thing? Because certainly I look at this from a European perspective coming into the US, we've always had great admiration in Europe, but with the fantastic success the US has had, it managed to integrate newcomers to the country. And this is something that the US has historically done extraordinarily well. Yet we're seeing with cases like Saipov, and increasingly with some of these Islamist attacks, that integration assimilation process is beginning to break down. And I think that's where the US needs to look. What can we change? How can we begin to instill these values that make people want to feel part of the country, which the US has had such success with historically, but is beginning to struggle with lately?
All right. Robin Simcox, thank you so much for joining us, sir. It's very interesting, obviously, as we spent the better half of the week analyzing, with this terror investigation. So it's interesting to have you on. Sir, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Elizabeth.